Hello and welcome to our Lakeside Chat. We are David Wofford and Katie Noonan, co-chairs of the Rotary Nature Center Friends. And we're so happy that you can join us tonight.
As we begin our program, it is important for us to acknowledge that we are on stolen land, that Lake Merritt is part of Ohlone territory. We hear now from Corinna Gould, spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn and co-founder of Segura Te Land Trust.
Good afternoon, relatives. My name is Corinna Gould. I am the spokesperson for the Confederated Villages of LaShawn. We are here today at what most folks think of as Lake Merritt. We are in the territory of Huichin. Huichin is actually a territory that encompasses 6 Bay Area cities: Oakland, Berkeley, Alameda, Emeryville, Albany, and Piedmont. And this was a place of abundance. I'm so happy that people from all walks of life that now come into our territory can enjoy this beautiful place that my ancestors have enjoyed since the beginning of time. My relationship to the land that I have been born to, raising my children and grandchildren here, has been to tell the story, the truth of what happened on this land before other people came here. I'm hoping that as we begin to learn these lessons of fires in California, the pandemic that's happening, that human beings come back to living in reciprocity with the earth.
Words never more true today as when Corinna spoke them at the site of Lake Merritt back in 2020, when we began to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the Lake Merritt Wildlife Refuge. And today, we keep in our thoughts and memories the people who are suffering today from the effects of climate change, from the effects of human inhumanity to fellow humans throughout the world, and especially in the Middle East. And so we thank you for joining us here tonight in a beautiful, peaceful place to learn a lot about what people are inspired to do to take care of nature and our planet and their fellow people. Rotary Nature Center Friends wants to thank, especially tonight, the San Francisco Estuary Partnership for putting on a wonderful event this last week, the State of the San Francisco Bay Estuary Conference, and wanted to show a few photos of one of that. Yes. So we really enjoyed learning all the science and the policy. 2 days of nerding out on all of that wonderful knowledge. And we were very happy to be able to bring in some community college students, high school students, and even middle school students to come and see the posters, the displays, and hear some of the talks. It was very inspirational. And we want to thank SFEP, especially the staff that worked with us so closely, trying to get people, get a list of people who are admitted to the conference as students without charge. It was really, everyone said it was amazing, and they were so thrilled to be able to see people talking about and showing evidence and pictures and arguments about things that they had studied in school, but never really had a chance to see. So we want to thank Janai Southworth for bringing in Lake Merritt plankton and giving everyone a chance to see it firsthand. So it's my great pleasure tonight to introduce our special guest, Eli Kersh, who is the president of the LakeTech Corporation and is the lead engineer scientist coordinator for the Lake Merritt water quality management pilot project that has been in developing and building steam over the past 2.5 years, really. And we're really thrilled that he is here to talk to us tonight about the projects that he is overseeing, and all the challenges and the science and technology that is behind that. So welcome, Eli. And I wanted to add that I mentioned, not everybody could have seen that Eli is a Oakland graduate from Piedmont High School. And before he got into his lake management line of work, he was a firefighter. And he was also he went to the UC Santa Barbara and got a degree in cartography and in geographic information systems. I hope I get that right. And then he also got a master's degree from the Cal State East Bay, working on the specific of lake management, and did his master's, his dissertation on managing lakes. And so without further ado, Eli, I want to welcome you. Eli, are you ready? Thank you.
Everyone can hear me. So yes, I'm Eli Kersh. I'm really happy to be here. I'm excited. As they said, there's been around here for a long time. The one bit of trivia that didn't make it into there was in 2009-ish, I took a position with Urban Strategies, which is a local nonprofit here in Oakland. And I worked on contract with them as a crime analyst for the Oakland Police Department. That was after graduating and working in GIS. I was making maps for the police department of crime analysis in the city of Oakland. And one day I sat back in my cubicle and I thought, how did I get stuck in a cubicle? And I literally had a vision of myself on a boat taking water samples. And I thought, how can I make that happen? And so I found an opportunity to go back to school at Hayward and started studying limnology, which is essentially oceanography of fresh water. So it does include estuaries and sloughs, deltas, and primarily inland water bodies that are or are not brackish. So the thing that's started this company in its current form is that there's been a real revolution in technology, and it's happening quickly. To think back to 2009, when I moved back to Oakland, that was about when I got my first smartphone. It was just right around then. That isn't that long ago, really, in the big picture. And since that time, we've really seen a revolution in the ability to get all sorts of data onto the internet quickly in real time, whether that be photos and webcams and home security cameras to even simple home weather stations. And the same has happened in water quality. And so my company has really tried to take a lead on empowering our clients of all types, from private residents to cities, municipalities, and governments, to find and take advantage of this real revolution in technology. And this map you see right now shows some, but not even all, of the buoys we currently have deployed primarily in North America. We actually are just put 2 in a box that are going to New Zealand. I have 3 that are UPS is carrying up to the Calgary, Edmonton area. And we even have 3 more going into Lake Ontario that are not currently on. So as you can see, we've got quite a lot going on. And if you zoom in here, whoops, I'll exit page. We have a lot of buoys all over the world, and we partner with lots of great companies and other people and scientists in every one of these states to help get this information to the public. And so that's what we've done here at Lake Merritt. I'll give a quick shout out to this company, In Situ. This is the brand of equipment that we're using. And in my opinion, it's a fantastic brand. But I want to show it to you also so you have an understanding of the type of equipment we're using. This device you're looking at here is called a multi-parameter sonde. A sonde is essentially a device that has a series of sensors in it. So this particular device here has the ability to have 4 sensors. And typically you would do things like dissolved oxygen, conductivity, which a lot of us refer to as salinity, temperature. You can measure things like turbidity, clarity, visibility. So we call that turbidity when we use sensors. We can also even measure algae, the abundance of algae. So this is what the device looks like. And to go back, this picture here that you see on the right of my screen, this is what the buoys look like. There's now 4 of these in Lake Merritt. You might have noticed in the initial pictures Katie showed, we were using a small white buoy. We've since upgraded them, but it's the same technology inside of them. And what we have here is this big yellow buoy with an aluminum cylinder through the middle, kind of protects the equipment that's inside it. In fact, you can see one here over my shoulder. That's one at Lake Merritt. But this device, what we've done is we've put one here in the top, and then we also have one at the bottom. So as the trivia asked, is this really a lake? And the answer is no, it's an estuary. But it's a very interesting type of estuary because of the urban watershed. And there's a lot of interesting dynamics that take place where we have interaction between fresh water and bay water, warm water and cold water, runoff during storm events, variations in salinity and temperature and other constituents in the water. And this results in very interesting dynamics with layering in the lake at different times. Of course, we also have tidal events and we have the tide gate. So there's a lot of different factors at play. That's why we have sensors at the top and at the bottom, because the lake regularly, the estuary, Lake Merritt, regularly has very different water quality conditions taking place at the top and at the bottom. And sometimes they're rather hard to understand and the opposite of what you might expect them to be. So we'll look at some of those examples. The red tide that unfortunately took place really brought to the surface, I think, a lot of efforts that have been made to manage Lake Merritt over the course of decades, really. There were a lot of people, many of you are on this meeting, who've been working really hard to restore, manage, maintain Lake Merritt. And unfortunately, with lots of things in government and in the world in general, sometimes it takes this catastrophic reform to get the attention that they need. And I think that the red tide is a good example of that. There's been a lot of great reports and research and data collected in the past. And I think that now we're seeing a really great push with all of the stakeholders that are involved in the lake, including the city, including the state, including regional water boards and others who are all putting a lot of effort and attention into really trying to study this this lake, understand the threats it faces, the condition it's in, and then start developing some potential solutions. One thing I always tell all of my clients is there is no silver bullet. And that goes for any sort of management, whether it's your garden or an open space, a park, a forest. Nature is dynamic. It's always changing, and you can never be prepared for everything. But you can study it and make good educated guesses about how to resolve or prevent some of these problems. But it's always going to be changing. What works today may not work tomorrow. So we've started by monitoring the lake. We've gone now into the phase 2, which we've been doing for many months now, which is starting to evaluate some different types of equipment. So now I'll take a quick step back and talk a little bit about the equipment and what we have in the lake. To do that, I'm going to do a presentation I gave here about oxygenation and aeration systems. This is a presentation I actually gave for UC Davis here. Before we talk about aeration and oxygenation, I always like to start out my talks with a little bit of background on what our objectives typically are in a normal lake setting, more so than in an estuary. But I think this is an important place for us all to start. I like to tell people that if you learn nothing from this talk except for the word eutrophication, you're already going to be the smartest person in the room at your next party. In fact, if you just say this word out loud, people think you're smart. So I'll say it again, eutrophication. We should all say it together. I sometimes refer to it as putrefaction. But essentially what it is all water bodies, this goes for all water bodies on planet Earth, with very few exceptions, succumb to a process called eutrophication. What eutrophication is it's a process whereby nutrients start to accumulate in water bodies. And this applies to Lake Merritt and other estuaries, sloughs as well, where these sediments either are transported in via runoff or deposited through pollen and dust coming down from the atmosphere, rain. Of course, we think of a lot of times nutrients coming in from fertilizers, from farming activities, or even lawn fertilizers in urban settings. But eventually, these nutrients start to build up, and eventually they create excessive growth in the lake. And by excessive growth, we really mean algae and plants growing at a rate that is faster than they can be consumed. So sometimes people talk about a lake or a pond being in balance. I'm not sure I agree with that way of describing a lake ecosystem, but it is fitting when you're thinking about eutrophication. So once we start getting too much nutrients, too much runoff, too much pollution, we can exceed the ability of a site to consume those nutrients, and the algae will start to bloom and proliferate, or plants start to grow out of control. When that happens, they eventually do die for various reasons. Maybe it's winter, it could be temperature driven. With algae, we often get these blooms where populations grow out of control, and then they actually will die out for various reasons, either just overpopulation, or there's a loss of the nutrients that they need. And so when that happens, the bacteria in the mud will start acting as decomposers, and the bacteria use oxygen in their metabolism to start decomposing algae and other dying plants and stuff. And when that happens, you can deplete oxygen. Of course, that is believed what happened at the fish kill, that so many algae died off that the oxygen levels in the lake basically depleted to zero and the fish suffocated. When a lake goes anoxic, a lot of other reactions take place in the sediment interface down at the bottom of the lake. And often it results in the release of even more nutrients from the bottom, from the mud. So that anoxic condition will result in the release of more nutrients, which essentially create a feedback loop. And the process begins again. So often when we're dealing with lakes and thinking about how to manage lakes correctly, we want to understand, is anoxia occurring at the bottom of the lake? And if it is it causing exacerbated eutrophication? Standard lakes that don't have tidal inflow stratify. They typically stratify in the summer months. The warm water at the surface becomes less dense, sort of like warm air rises, warm water also rises. And it can become significantly different in density to the point where it actually creates layers in a lake. Now, when those layers set in, it actually will prevent the lake from mixing. When the wind blows, often the lake will mix and roll over, and the water from the top will go down to the bottom, and the water from the bottom gets pulled up to the surface. A lot of the oxygen in lakes comes from its gas exchange with the atmosphere, maybe about half in some situations. The other half comes from the production of oxygen via photosynthesis from plants and algae that live in the water. Oxygen is a byproduct of photosynthesis. Same way as trees use carbon dioxide and make oxygen, aquatic plants and algae do the same thing. So unfortunately, though, when a lake stratifies, which is a natural process, it can separate the bottom water from the surface. And of course, there aren't a lot of plants and algae often living at the bottom of lakes. So there's not anything making oxygen down there, but there are still things consuming oxygen. So this process is happening in a unique way in Lake Merritt as well. And that's part of our reason, another reason why we're measuring the temperature and oxygen and salinity at the surface as well as at the bottom of this lake. This is kind of some fancy graphs here, but the main thing to keep your eye on here is this graph on the left. To get your mind around it, the y-axis, the vertical axis going up and down, that's depth in a lake or a pond. And on the x-axis going side to side is the amount of oxygen and temperature. So you can see here at the surface, as you start at the top and you move your way down to the middle, you see that it's kind of uniformly warm, and there's a uniform amount of oxygen in that top several feet. In this case, the graph shows meters here. We get to this middle layer in the middle of the graph here where you see it sharply drops off. We call that the thermocline. And again, he can show you this here in this graph here, the thermocline. And then there at the bottom, you see it becomes uniformly colder temperatures, and the oxygen also tends to deplete, and sometimes to zero, as it does in this case. The way we collect this data is we simply take a water quality monitoring equipment sensor, and we slowly lower it from the top all the way down to the bottom of the lake. And that's how we can then graph this chart here. So a lot of times when we manage lakes, we want to make sure we're maintaining oxygen at the bottom of the lake. And there's a couple ways we try to do this. I personally break them really into two different categories. One is artificial circulation or mechanical mixing, and another one is hypolimnetic oxygenation. I see there are some. Is there any questions? Okay, I will I will leave it to maybe a moderator to chime in and let me know if there's any questions immediately to answer. But I look forward to reading those more thoroughly later. So one of the major questions we have with Lake Merritt, because it is not a traditional lake, right? It's tidally influenced, muted tidal, right? There is a tide gate that can be operated and manipulated. So I think official term is a muted tidal estuary. So one of the major issues here for us to think about is which type of strategy, which type of equipment is really best suited for this environment. And so we have to think about how these pieces of equipment really work, and which one would be most effective. So the type of artificial circulation most people, aeration, most people are familiar with is something called diffused aeration. And a lot of you may have seen lakes or ponds or other places where you see bubbles coming to the surface in the bottom of from the bottom of the lake. There's usually lots of round bubble plumes, and you see maybe a 5, 6, or a dozen of these spread around the lake. A lot of people think that what you're doing, excuse me, is like a fish tank, where you have a small bubble stone in the bottom of a fish tank dissolving some air into the water. In actuality, very little of that gas is being dissolved into the water. It's less than 3% at max per foot of rise can be dissolved into the water. And it depends on the volume of air being pumped and the size of the bubbles and a number of other factors. But only 3% of the air per foot can be dissolved. So if we're using regular air, most do in those devices you may have seen, regular air that we're breathing is only 20%, 21% oxygen. And so if you're trying to bubble oxygen into a lake with diffusers, it really doesn't make a measurable impact. And we'll talk a little more about this. But what this device does, as this graphic shows, the devices are meant to do is they're meant to create artificial circulation. As those bubbles rise, they entrain water, and that water comes up to the surface. And that takes that oxygen depleted water at the bottom of the lake, and it allows it to exchange gas with the atmosphere. We call it gas flux. And that's where oxygen can try to reach equilibrium with the amount of oxygen in the water. So these devices are really about creating artificial circulation. Now, this is really helpful if you have a site where you have strong stratification, whether it's thermal stratification or for some other reason, and where oxygen gets depleted at the bottom of the lake. If we can prevent the lake from forming those layers, we may be able to deplete that low dissolved oxygen condition from occurring. Another way to do it is what's called an updraft circulator. Back in the 80s, there was a device called a Solar Bee, which is pictured here. Some of you may remember these. They are a solar-powered pump that sucks water from the bottom of the lake and brings it to the surface. They were all the rage for a while, but unfortunately, it's been pretty well established at this point that they really aren't very effective. And there's much more effective devices on the market. In fact, relatively easy to obtain consumer grade electric motors now have sufficient horsepower and are a low enough cost that it's actually easier to simply just take a regular electrically powered motor, suspend it from a float. And we've done some research at some lakes in Wisconsin where we actually showed that these devices can pull water from as low as about 8 feet down below them and disrupt stratification and circulate water quite effectively and quickly changing oxygen. There are other types as well, which less used. But I'll before I go to there, I found this graphic online. One of the problems with artificial circulators that are these mechanical fountain type devices is if you do have a heavily stratified lake, they won't be able to disrupt that density stratification of the water. The dense, colder water will stay down at the bottom, and the only way to disrupt that stratification layer, that density gradient, is to extend a tube below the fountain to the bottom. This means that this style or this approach to artificial circulation is really more suitable for shallow water and more challenging if you're attempting to do it in a deeper water body. The last type is called a downdraft circulator, which, as you can see from this image, is very uncommon. But they do exist. That's just a silly picture if you were questioning its fountains flipped upside down. But they actually do exist. But these are typically just, it's a big fan, a big motor that pushes water down. And these are typically used in tanks, water tanks and other sorts of things. They had historically been used in lakes and reservoirs, but they're not really used very often anymore. So moving on, what is really the value of adding oxygen, and why are we trying to do it? Whether it's using a hypolumnetic oxygenation system or an artificial circulation system, we all understand that fish need oxygen, but that's really just a small part of the puzzle. Oxygen is a really important chemical in a lot of processes in all aquatic ecosystems. So by creating mixing, I'm going to jump around a little bit here on this slide. I think one of the most important things here is that we're increasing the habitat for aerobic organisms. And I don't just mean fish. I'm really talking about zooplankton, microorganisms of all sorts, things that live in the mud, even bacteria, fungus, all kinds of organisms. Those guys are often an integral part of a food chain as both grazers on algae, as well as a food source themselves. So by increasing the area of a lake that's habitable, you can increase the populations of these. And that really yields a lot of great benefits for an environment overall. If you think back to thinking about eutrophication, one of the reasons we get excessive growth of certain organisms is excess nutrients. So if we can increase the overall carrying capacity, essentially, of an aquatic ecosystem by making more of it habitable, those populations can expand and grow in abundance, and thereby consume more of these nutrients or consume more of the algae or compete with the algae for nutrients. The other benefits of artificial circulation devices, primarily those fountain type devices, is in some settings, algae don't really like fast moving water. And there's a lot of good research, published research, that shows if you can create enough velocity and movement of water, you can disrupt and prevent algae from even growing in the first place. And by algae, I'm really thinking about and talking about the harmful algae species, cyanobacteria, and I think I think there's less known about the red tide that we've specifically had, but most organisms tend to have very defined habitable zones in the water column, and by creating artificial circulation, we can disrupt those habitats where they might otherwise thrive. And then the last component here to address is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, when you have anoxic conditions with low oxygen, a lot of times that results in the release of nutrients from the sediment. Now, I won't get too in depth there, but oxygen plays a really important role as an oxidizer. A lot of chemical reactions require oxygen. A lot of organisms require oxygen to metabolize. And so oxygen doesn't just feed living organisms, it also has is the fuel source for a lot of chemical reactions that take place in mud, in lakes, and in the environment. And so having oxygen present isn't just about the fish. The takeaway here is that oxygen is a vital component for any ecosystem to break down pollutants, oxidize harmful metals, to increase habitable zones, as well as simply to be breathable by organisms in the water as well. So I'll show you a couple quick examples to talk about the differences and show some examples of projects we've worked on where we compare the two types of aeration. This is a map here of a site in Novato where we installed a diffused aeration system. This particular this is also an estuary. It is a saltwater site. It has a tide gate on it as well. These folks keep the tide gates closed most of the time and open it only occasionally to flush the lagoon, monthly or so. So because that water comes into this site and then is stagnant, it falls victim to thermal stratification and oxygen depletion. It's also very deep. It's over 40 feet deep. So because of that, we were able to very effectively install strategically placed bubble diffusers and release the right amount of air to disrupt that stratification from occurring and make sure that the water is vertically mixing and circulating. So this image here is a more close-up image of one of these systems turning on. The way you know it's working effectively, as you can see in this graph here at the bottom, we have the oxygen and temperature sensors at the top and the bottom of this particular site. So here you can see the top is getting hot during the day and cooling off at night, but the bottom water, the dark red is the top of the lake, the orange is the bottom of the lake temperature. You can see there's stratification. There's a difference in temperature between the top and the bottom. As a result, you can see the dark blue is the oxygen at the surface, the light blue is the oxygen at the bottom. There's also a difference in oxygen. When we turn on the diffuser system, which is indicated by this dashed line, you can see here that the temperatures homogenize. There's no thermal density gradient between the top and the bottom of this lake. And as a result, you can also see the oxygen homogenizes. That's also now the same between the top and the bottom of the lake. This is a classic diffused aeration system. These only really work well in deeper water bodies. This is a close-up example of that graph there I just described, where you can see the temperatures are homogenized. We've vertically mixed the entire water body and the oxygen and temperatures are equal from top to bottom. The next type of device, the alternative method to artificial circulation, is something called hypolimnetic oxygenation. This, instead of relying on mixing energy, we're actually going to dissolve oxygen into the water. And there's a number of ways this is done. And I won't go into all of them, but I described some of them here on this slide. For the sake of time, I'll focus just on the one that we're attempting to use in Lake Merritt. This device is based on a concept that's been around since the 70s. On the left-hand side, you can see it here. It's a device that sucks in water from the bottom of a lake. You can see here the water comes in through this pipe to a pump chamber on shore. It's mixed with oxygen in this line here, and then that cold water is pumped back down to the bottom of the lake. And the reason you take water in from the bottom is because it's colder, denser water. If I was to try to suck water from the surface of the lake, where it's warmer and less dense, and pump it to the bottom of the lake, it would simply float back up to the surface. And we would potentially not be making any real impact on the lake. The device we're using is based on this concept. And this concept is really well understood. It uses these two formulas here, essentially, which say if I compress a gas in a container with a liquid, that gas will dissolve into the liquid at a certain rate. And it's very easy to calculate and compute what that concentration of gas, how much of that gas will dissolve, and therefore what concentration of oxygen you have in the water that's released from the system. I like to tell people it's kind of like seltzer water, right? We pressurize CO2 into a chamber with water. What do you get? You get bubbly water, right? The concentration of that carbon dioxide in your soda can and your seltzer bottle, when you're looking at the bottle and it's closed, you don't see any bubbles, right? It just looks like a clear liquid. The moment you open that can or pour that seltzer out of the bottle, you start to see bubbles happening. What you've done is you've released the pressure off of the gas, off of the liquid, and therefore the excess dissolved gas in your liquid is trying to reach equilibrium and leave that water and go back into the atmosphere. Water and the air like to have a balance of the amount of molecules. And so the same thing happens with an oxygenation system. If I was to pump a bunch of oxygen into water and dissolve it in the water and put it right back on the surface of a lake, it would bubble. It would create bubbles. And all that oxygen would go right back into the atmosphere. So the key to these systems is to try to trap that dissolved gas in the water, to trap it at the bottom of the lake. And for that reason, we pull the cold water from the bottom layer, and we use the top layers like a lid to keep the bubbles in our seltzer water, if you will. I hope I haven't lost anybody. So, to move on, let's talk a little bit about what we've
this
seen.
is great.
Mary,
So
yes.
did you want to ask if somebody, if would you like to take a question or something?
Yeah, let's hear it.
First of all, let me ask you though, are you going to be able to continue to discuss with us after 8?
Absolutely. I can discuss a little after 8. I was
Cool.
going to suggest we all meet up at Heart and Dagger right by Lake Merritt and have a beer.
Now that sounds like a plan, but some of us can't make it. So thank you everyone for coming. Special thanks to Eli for a wonderful presentation. I could go on for hours. You're just so approachable and explain things so well. I really appreciate that. And to all the supporting and contributing people, including the City of Oakland and Lake Merritt Boating Center, Lake Merritt Institute, and our volunteers, Lake Merritt Rotary Nature Center Friends volunteers, have been out collecting water quality and plankton data. So coming up, we have a special Lakeside Chat in July called Reflections on Lake Merritt, a wonderful documentary in the making about Lake Merritt with the filmmaker and director Brandon Jordan. And there are segments of it which have some of our very favorite contributors. Jim Covell's on there. Oh gosh, so many people are there. Stephanie Benavides is interviewed. Just wonderful cultural and environmental presentation. So I will send out the information for that soon. On the whole month of June, we'll be celebrating Snapshot Cal Coast with the California Academy of Science. This is another iNaturalist event, and we'll have a table on June 22nd at the Boathouse Beach to help people make observations on that one day, which we've done throughout the year. It's one of the things that Rotary Nature Center Friends really likes to do. So there's a community-wide Love Our Lake initiative going on this summer, and we will be participating in that with our usual water testing, plankton monitoring, but we were thinking of having mornings in the marsh, which would be to take a look at that demonstration marsh, which was established by Measure DD, award-winning project of Oakland Public Works, right off of the parking lot, and do some gentle tending and examination of what's going on there, and eventually some planting as we get some irrigation and so forth. So think about adding that to your calendar in this beautiful summer. Okay, Lakeside Chat are rebroadcast on Sundays from 6 to 7 p.m. on KTOP TV. And we have the Lakeside Chat of the month is in the last half of the month on KTOP, and the oldies but goodies will be in the first two Sundays of that month. We get our support from many supporting organizations. We'd like to acknowledge the Frederick E. Hart Foundation for Educational Opportunity. We'd like to acknowledge all of our volunteers, partners, and participants, speakers. Make this a community that is dedicated to both the human and the wildlife and the broader ecology context of our lives at Lake Merritt. If you enjoy what we do, please consider making a donation. We take young people out on boats. We buy plants for planting, and we do a number of things. We do water quality testing. All of these things have some expenses, and it would be very helpful if you decided you'd like to give us a little bit of support for that. Our website is here, and we'll include that in the post-chat send out, and has a donation PayPal button. Our producer is Rob Lamone, and David Wofford and I are the co-chairs of Rotary Nature Center Friends. Kristen Furman does art and design, Dr. Janice Lord Walker, Betsy Schultz, Patty Donald, and many of our RNCF volunteers, including that wonderful support from the City of Oakland California Climate Corps Action Fellows this year. We have our mission. We're an all-volunteer 501c3 nonprofit advocating for the Nature Center in Lakeside Park as an interpretive education and science center for all the people of Oakland. Yes, and so as primary stewards of the lake, we do bird watching, nature walks, plant identification, planting and weeding, and water testing. In conclusion, before we go to conclusion, I'd just like to show the slide that announcing Lakeside Chat number 44 on July 12th. It's going to be very exciting. A documentary in the making about Lake Merritt. Finally, yes, we have many, many people who are supporting us in so many ways. We want to thank every one of them. So I am going to, and finally, we wish to look forward to July, which is Lake Appreciation Month, and we all love our lake, or our estuary, as we more accurately call it. And so we'll be celebrating that with the Great Seki Dip-In, of course, and other lake-centered events as well.
Oakland wanted to do a pilot to look at these two different strategies to affect Lake Merritt. This graph here that you see, and you can all access these graphs now online by going to my.laketech.com/public-portals/Lake Merritt. We'll share that in the chat here. And you can all access most of these charts and graphs. And you can see here, I can hover over these charts and graphs, and I can turn layers on and off, or hover over the layers. So I can look at things specifically that I'm interested in. So here's, for example, looking at the top and the bottom oxygen levels in the lake from far back. But I can also throw on temperature, so I can understand stratification. And I can also look at air temperature and rain and tide gates. So in these situations, you can zoom into these graphs. And in these examples, you'll see a lot of interesting stuff occurring. You'll see here in this graph that the purple line, excuse me, as the chart loads, if we zoomed in really close, you'll start seeing really interesting interactions between high and low tide, warm and cold water, and oxygen levels. Because we have an interplay between salt water and fresh water, as well as thermal stratification, we see lots of mixing and flipping regularly occurring, depending on the season, as well as depending on rain. So I'm zooming in again. And so what we've attempted to do with these two different strategies is find locations in the lake that would be suitable for each method to create aeration or oxygenation. So you can see in this chart here how high and low tides, which is the purple line, can relate to or interact with temperature in the water. You can also see in a lot of these charts how rain has an impact on all of these. Because we have 4 buoys, and each buoy has 2 oxygen temperature sensors, top and bottom, if I scroll all the way down here, we have a tremendous amount of data about the lake. We have sensors right next to the oxygenation system. We have them further away. We have them at the inflow and in the 2 different arms. So one thing I'll show you here as an example, just this line I'm hovering over, this is the sensor that's attached to the oxygenation system. So this red line. So if you zoom in here, you can see it is actually, you do see some improvements as a result of that oxygenation system. One of the challenges that we've experienced with using this approach is the amount of mixing and tidal influence has made it very challenging to evaluate specifically whether or not this oxygenation system in this particular area is having the desired impact. So the piece of equipment we've installed is not meant to oxygenate the whole lake. It's a smaller system designed to be used to measure a localized impact in an area where we deemed appropriate with lower tidal flows we suspected. And so you can interact with this data and start to understand some of these very interesting dynamics that are at play here. With the last thing I'll add is we talked about thermal stratification, warm water rising, and cold water sinking. If we have 2 cups of water that are the same temperature, but one is salt water, like the bay, it will be 4 times denser than the cup of fresh water at the same temperature. So normally in a lake where it's all fresh water, we're only interested in the temperature gradient causing thermal stratification. But in this environment, we not only have to deal with temperature, we also have to deal with the density stratification as a result of the salt water. So we've had an interesting interplay with a tremendous amount of data, and it makes it rather complicated to tease out the impact of one factor over another. And we are measuring all of these factors here: salinity, density, oxygen, and temperature. So with that, I'll stop the formal presentation and we can talk a little more if you guys would like to ask some questions.
Oh, somebody asked, are you able to leverage AI to help with analysis?
Yes, potentially. Inherently, where AI is starting to play a role for our company right now is developing some algorithms and code that will help us to clean and quality control the data. Collecting environmental data is inherently challenging. It is very easy for a plastic bag to get wrapped around a sensor. We go out every 2 weeks to clean our equipment. And it is amazing the stuff we find attached to our buoys. So AI right now, we're leveraging it more to help us identify patterns and trends and potentially identify quality control issues. So I'll mention that with this data, we're constantly attempting to clean and evaluate. It's an ongoing process, and it's never perfect. But AI is starting to get used more and more for that quality control purpose. As far as generating reports and evaluating the data, we have some pretty good statistical tools that have been developed already. I think AI will play a role in that in the future more. But there's some pretty well-established ways to do statistical analysis on large data sets like this to tease out statistically significant variation in the data.
Okay, so Jean asks, what is that machinery that everybody's seeing on the dock at Glen Echo? I think you've talked about it, but maybe just to come back to that point for people who are, processing all this great information. The machinery on the dock near Glen Echo Creek, what is that?
Yeah, this is a schematic, and I'm sorry, I must have rushed through this. This is a schematic of the actual device that's installed in Lake Merritt. On the dock that you see in the green fenced area is an oxygen generator housed in a trailer. It's in a trailer primarily for safety and that it's temporary. So we didn't build a structure or dig a vault for it because we weren't really sure. We still want to evaluate the efficacy of this type of equipment. What that oxygen generator does is it pumps oxygen down to the chamber here at the bottom of the lake, where it dissolves the oxygen into the water. So you have an intake line that sucks the cold water or the dense water into the device here. And then the oxygen is pumped down through a line to the bottom of the lake. And then it's dissolved into the water body here. If you look here, this is what the device looks like in real life. And this is actually your green trailer. This was the day we installed it. We floated it out into the water here, and I'll show you what that actually looks like. This was us installing the intake and discharge lines. You can see them extending out into the lake. I'll play that here. That's Daniel, and Paul Ganser is the guy in the blue shirt. He's actually the inventor of this device, the patent holder. He was gracious enough to come out and help my team and install it. So we've pushed the intake and discharge lines out into the lake. And then the real fun part is the chamber itself. You could see there it's about 7.5 feet tall. I'm 5'9" for your reference. And here's the very delicate way you install it in the lake. To show you that again, you push it into the lake. The device is designed so that it floats, and you pull it out into the lake like this with a rope from your boat, and you flip a switch and it sinks down to the bottom of the lake, giving you this here. So what you're seeing there in the trailer in the green fenced off area is only a bunch of oxygen generators and some computers that control the oxygen generator flow rates. But everything where the magic happens is actually on the bottom of the lake.
Eli, I would say that's about as clear as Lake Merritt.
Well, I mean, there's certain areas that are pretty clear. So let's see. I'm looking at the.
No, you don't have to. It's probably clear enough.
Yeah, Lake Merritt is actually very clear right now, which it typically is in the summertime when the phytoplankton are different, and we have it's very clear right now. But we had a question I wanted that kind of followed off of when it was just asked, and that is, you know, how is the oxygenation system working, and have you been able to detect the effect of the oxygen that you're infusing in the Glen Echo arm?
Yeah, you can. It's fleeting, but we've definitely been able to detect the impact. I think there's a few ways. We see that when there is more stratification occurring and less stratification occurring, you can tell, you can see an impact more easily. The challenge there is those stratification events can sometimes be 3 to 6 hours long and happen multiple times a day because of tidal exchanges. Right now, if you guys go to the Glen Echo arm, if you look at the data, there's very little stratification. The salinity and the temperature difference in the lake is minimal to none. And as a result, you can actually see the gas coming to the surface of the lake. If you look closely, you'll see a large white plume at the bottom of the lake. And this, I think I have a picture of this to show you right here. This is what it looks like. This is, I raised the device to the surface of the lake for maintenance and cleaning. You can see this white milky color in the water. That is dissolved oxygen, very, very high concentration dissolved oxygen, sublimating or turning back into a gas. I don't think sublimating is actually the right word, but it's off gassing. And this is because I brought the system to the surface. And when there's no stratification, this device, which usually sits on the bottom, which is about 10 or 12 feet deep, depending on tide, you'll see the white plume coming to the surface. And so depending on that density, salt water, temperature, stratification condition, that oxygen will either come up to the surface or travel laterally. So we've been doing a lot of evaluation, attempting to understand when conditions are suitable for that oxygen to travel laterally, where is it going and how much of it is getting there. There's a lot of challenges to oxygenating water bodies in general. One of them is having to do with the fact that if there's already high oxygen in the water, it's very difficult to raise it even more. If the oxygen in the lake, if we had had another red tide kill, red tide and a die off and oxygen depleted, it would be really easy to see the impact of the device because oxygen around it would be zero. And so we would see the impact of the device very effectively. When oxygen around the device is already 8 to 10 parts per million, it's very difficult to see smaller impacts. They call it the driving force of oxygen, which is if I have a glass of water with no oxygen, it might take 1 pound of oxygen to raise it to 1 part per million. But to go from 1 to 2 parts per million is going to take 2 pounds or 3 pounds of oxygen. So it's an exponential, the driving force of adding oxygen. The more oxygen there is, the harder it is to raise it even more. So that's been a challenge as well to factor in to our evaluation.
I'm looking through here. Oh yes. So Shanti wants to know, is there similar concerns and solutions for the ocean?
If you ask a company trying to make a device for that, then they would say yes. I'm not so certain. I think that scalability is really the issue. If we were in the United Arab Emirates right now, I'd say yes. You've got $40 million. Let's try it. But it's not really feasible. It's very difficult. Lots of power consumption is needed. There's large footprints involved. There's a lot of water exchange. In fact, I think we definitely underestimate the amount of tidal exchange in the bay that takes place. The general public, that is, in myself included. When there's a tidal exchange, that's a lot of water moving. And so to overcome that short residence time, you have to install some pretty heavy duty equipment to get a lot of oxygen into the water so that it doesn't just drift away.
So
it doesn't tend to stick around.
I mean, it does seem that what you're saying is true, that that there is that maybe that the effect of tidal flow has been somewhat underestimated. I know there have been models that suggest that there are parts of the lake which are inaccessible because of elevation and so forth. But if we have these currents changing things in such a dramatic way, we might be trying to fix the ocean if the tide gates are open, if we're trying to do this on a regular basis. To what extent is your project directed towards creating a refuge if there should be a similar a similar event to what was experienced uniquely really in August 2022?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right question to be asking here. The devices that we've installed, the main focus when we presented this, Dr. Bailey and I and Alex Horn started presenting this specific device with the intent that it would create an oxygen refuge. What we've seen, unfortunately, is we haven't had any really poor oxygen conditions, which would allow us to better evaluate the equipment. So, not that we would want to have a zero oxygen situation occur, but again, when we already have pretty much consistently had fully saturated oxygenated water coming in and out, it's difficult to super saturate that water, especially because it is shallow. there's not a lot of stratification, meaning the lid that we're putting on isn't on very tight. And so it's really easy for that gas to escape. I do think that if we would have a bloom die-off event, we would see a significantly better environment in the immediate vicinity of this device. Would it save all of the fish in Lake Merritt? Definitely not. Nor would it be designed to be. A much bigger or many more units would likely be required, or an entirely different type of equipment altogether might be required. This is a very challenging site because of not just the tidal influence, but it's also very shallow. We have other factors we've been looking into as well. The data has revealed some interesting potential phenomenon occurring because of rain and also because of high tides and low tides interacting with the storm drainage system. So there's been a lot of other factors that have come up that the real-time data has brought to our attention about the lake, not just about the oxygenation system, but about the lake behavior as a whole. So there's been a lot of learning, and it unfortunately has also really complicated our ability to isolate the impact of the equipment.
Yeah, I'm just thinking how grateful I am to this project to have provided such a great characterization of the functioning of Lake Merritt. My only thought is, what is the baseline from which we should compare this? And especially you bring up Alex Horn and his work with wetlands, and particularly low oxygen wetlands, which are healthy and a typical wetland in some parts of the bay. So I think I'd like to hear that going on. We had a really great question come up here, which I want to.
Just to chime in on that point, Katie, you made a great point there, and you brought that up in the stakeholder meeting a week or so ago. And I'll say that I've heard the term baseline be tossed around a lot since you brought it up. And I think there's real interest in getting those baselines. And with the ability to gather data at the frequency and quantity that we can now more easily at a lower cost, I think we're going to start seeing a really good push toward that. That said, you also brought up another really important point, which is, as I said in the beginning, there isn't going to be a single solution. There's no silver bullet. And you brought up the tidal wetlands and other things. And I think that coming up with a true management strategy isn't going to solve a problem, but it is going to encompass an integrated approach that's going to be looking at lots of factors, oxygenation being only one of those, whether it's circulation or oxygenation. There's also going to be a lot of other factors that people are going to start taking into this, whether that's nutrient reduction, pollution control, manipulation of the storm drain system to maybe have less of an impact on the lake, looking at changes to tide gates. There's a lot of factors, and I think that a management plan in the future, when it's developed, will be taking into account a lot of these things. Not to create a perfect environment or a perfect lake, but to definitely continue to strive toward continual improvement of the lake.
We had one really good question, and which is, have there been core samples taken to look at the history? I mean, we can take core samples now, perhaps, but I do believe there may have been core samples that could be examined looking at the history of the lake. And there's a lot that you can find out from looking at a core sample. I know Dr. Jerry Lips is in the room here somewhere, and I know that there may be some historical ones. I know Lake Merritt used to be a mud flat, and it was back before the closure. It was possibly quite different. We know that the mollusks, for example, were quite different at that time. Anyway, I'm going to stop talking. And
it's a great point. There's never a reason not to study history.
Right. That's a really good point. Um, I was wondering because I know people are bringing up the influence of the tidal flow and the somewhat our lack of understanding of the of what they are because we don't have a direct tracing
Right.
all the time. But I was noticing that we could in fact take a look at trends, looking at the different buoys that are out there.
Yeah.
So, for example, I do notice that when we see an improvement in the one that we're focusing on so intensely up there at Glen Echo, we quite frequently see the same trend going on at the other buoys. And I'm wondering how that can be informative, um, in, in taking a look at, what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's I think I'm not typically a huge fan of developing models. They're complicated. You can validate models with real data, but there is a lot of interesting hydrodynamics occurring in Lake Merritt, and the data has revealed, I think, a lot, already. But I do think that while I don't think we'll ever necessarily be able to say that we know and understand it 100% every square inch of Lake Merritt, I do think that a future study looking at tracer studies or creating a hydrodynamic model of the lake would really benefit the management of the lake long term. I think because of the red tide and the emergency desire to create oxygen refuges and start looking at different equipment and opportunities, we didn't have the time to put together the city. The city didn't have the luxury. A hydrodynamic model might take a year to develop and another year to validate, at least a year. I mean, it could take a long time, but I think it's definitely in the future, probably, if I had to guess, whether the state or the city or some other agency gets involved. I do think that starting to develop a model and look at that to be able to say with a little more confidence how those tides and how the manipulation of the tide gate will impact the lake. Right now, there's still a lot of speculation, and when we look at the data, sometimes it looks very clear, and sometimes it looks very garbled, and it can be very difficult to distinguish. Hi, Patty.
Hey. It says, Peggy says, what city agency do you primarily work with? And if we were to advocate for more dollars, I think, what would you suggest?
Send them to me via PayPal. No, I'm just kidding. I Jennifer Stern may still be on the line. Jennifer has been my point of contact at the city. That is, maybe she can jump on and introduce herself. They've been
That'd be
fantastic.
cool. We could spotlight her if you'd like to, Jennifer. I think
Yeah.
we could. We're having a Zoom staffing, low staffing situation here, but we could try.
She also has young kids like me, so she could be doing good.
Okay, let me see if I can put her. Okay, here we are, and we could.
Just unmuted myself.
I can pin you. Is that going to help? Oh
yeah,
no.
I think I hear her. Hi, Jennifer.
Okay,
Hi.
so wait. Pinning you.
I'm here, Katie. I do I can talk for just a second, but I do like Eli said, I've got kid bedtime right now, so I kind of don't have
Juggling
time. But yes, and what was the question again? It was
if you wouldn't mind just introducing maybe yourself and the department you work for and the role you guys are playing in the project.
Yes, Jennifer Stern with the City of Oakland and Public Works, Watershed and Stormwater Management Division, and I'm the project manager for the pilot project. So we hired Eli to do this, to help us put these devices in the lake and monitor them and see how they're working. Yeah, and it's been great. We're learning a lot. As Eli shared, we have it's sometimes hard to see how effective this has been because of the dynamic system we're working in. But we're going to keep monitoring probably for I think it's another 18 months at least, which is just the pilot project, just to see how effective these two devices are.
And I'll tag on to that. The state regional, the regional San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board had a meeting where the city attended. Many of you I see on the line here also attended. There's going to be a lot of resources put toward additional monitoring and evaluation of the data that we have collected, as well as future data that will be collected. The stakeholders involved in doing some of this research want to do it right, and they're going to do it the state way, which is a good way. It's slow and methodical, but it's accurate, and that takes a lot of time. I think when we started out, we would have all loved to be able to see immediate results and clear direction on where to go. And the data, even before we started installing, made it pretty clear this was going to take a lot of great minds to pick apart this data, and maybe even some AI brains as well, to really start to evaluate and compare all of these different data sets together in a reliable and accurate, repeatable way. It's going to take a lot of time, and the city's done a great job bringing together the stakeholders and working with all of the agencies, and myself included, to try to get us all working together. And we've developed some great relationships with the state people. We take them out on our boat with us, and it's been really, we've learned from them, and they've even learned from us a little, which has been surprising and great. So, Jennifer, thank you for all your support.
Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll just say a quick thing. We're looking at having a forum in July, a public forum to get input on our lake management plan and talk about our future management of the lake.
Thank you.
More to come on that.
So Eli, it's been what is it, 16 months or something since the harmful algal bloom caused of Heterosigma akashua, let's be precise about it. It's a kind of phytoplankton. So algae is kind of like a very broad term, and some algae are just absolutely essential to the ecosystem of the lake. But this one is there all the time, but in small amounts, but occasionally, or at this one time, got way out of control. And I'm wondering what you make of the fact that there has not been any, there hasn't been a return. And if there's anything we can learn at Lake Merritt about conditions which lead to a spark or don't lead to a spark of a harmful algal bloom.
Yeah. The short answer is it's probably people's prayers.
Yes.
The long answer is you bring up a really good point, which is there are tens of thousands of species of plankton, phytoplankton, specifically algae, types of algae. In normal lakes that I manage, we see a succession of different populations throughout the season. Every species that's present, of which there can be dozens and dozens of them at any one time, they all have very, very unique physiological needs. So some like warmer water, some like colder water, some like very specific salinities, levels of oxygen, levels of nutrients, different types of nutrients. So each species has its kind of ideal habitat. And that habitat is constantly changing seasonally, as well as through weather patterns. So we have an abnormally wet year, an abnormally dry year. Sometimes we have extended, prolonged periods of dry years. And we're getting changes not just in the lake, but we're getting changes all throughout the watershed. And those changes have to do with drought and wet years, prolonged drought, prolonged wet. And so it could very well have a lot to do with the prolonged drought that we had come out of at that time. And that can change all kinds of factors, not just in Lake Merritt, not just in Lake Merritt's watershed, but also in the Greater Bay as a whole. And that may have been playing a part in the wastewater treatment plants in the south of the bay and the constituents and concentrations of those nutrients. So there's a lot of factors to consider. I think it's a lot to get your head around. It's going to take teams. It may be something we never learn 100% exactly what those conditions were. It's a newer species to us here on the west coast of North America. So I think there's a lot for us to still learn about this particular species. But also there's still a lot to learn about Lake Merritt in general and all of the species and how they succeed each other over time and how these different populations boom and bust and interact and compete in Lake Merritt.
Yeah, I think Lake Merritt is a great place to study that. Having been fascinated by plankton for a very long time, we take pictures of it and send it to labs and so forth. So really thank you for sharing all this complexity that you're dealing with, and for really bringing this focus on our lake that we love, and it's the nation's first wildlife refuge. Really important.